Welcome to Frank's Fables. Roberto was only 9 years old when he first realized how harsh the orphanage could be. He had seen petty fights and stolen blankets, but nothing had ever scarred him more than seeing his little sister, Felicity, trembling in the cold stone corridors after the older kids dumped a bucket of icy water on her. Felicity was fragile, small for her age, prone to colds that turned into something worse. Roberto tried to shield her, wrapping his thin arms around her shoulders and whispering that someday they would have a warm home, with the smell of cooking bread drifting through tall windows and a big living room where they could sit together. Neither of them could remember their parents well, but they clung to dreams. Felicity's included a woman in a bright yellow dress, her face blurred by time, and for Roberto, it was a grand piano in a magnificent house, though he couldn't recall where he had seen it. Despite his patchy memories, he had one certainty: music made him feel alive. Every night, after dinner in the grim dining hall, Roberto waited for the other children to fall asleep. He slipped from bed, carefully lifting the scuffed black violin case from under the bunk. He tucked the instrument beneath his arm and walked along the corridor to the small supply closet that had decent acoustics and a lock on the door. It was the only place where the caregivers wouldn't barge in, and it was where Felicity, if her fever wasn't too bad, could join him to listen. There, in that cramped space smelling of mothballs and cleaning fluid, Roberto drew the bow across the strings, coaxing lullabies that resonated softly, weaving a comforting hush around the gloom. Sometimes he played with tears in his eyes. Other times he felt as though he were conjuring images from his past, a swirl of color and melody. And for a few precious minutes, both he and Felicity could forget about the orphanage. From the day he arrived, Roberto was teased about that black violin case. The other children, especially the older ones who had given up on any dream, called him a show-off. "What good is that thing in a place like this?" they would sneer. When they realized he had real talent, their jealousy deepened. They teased Felicity, too, calling her a weakling, an easy target. But the music was all they had that felt as though it belonged to them. The violin, with its worn edges and the faint initials CM, scratched near the bass, had been found with Roberto on the orphanage steps. Nobody ever came to claim the instrument or the children, so the staff allowed him to keep it. Over the years, the violin turned into something sacred, a piece of the puzzle that might lead him to his real family. Because of that, he guarded it with fierce devotion. One bitter winter night, Felicity grew ill, coughing so hard that her slender frame shook the bunk bed. Roberto rushed to her side, pressing a cool hand to her forehead. She was burning up. He begged the staff for help, but the caregivers merely shrugged. They had heard the coughing for months, and funds were scarce. Medicine was doled out to the sickest, and the staff decided Felicity might recover on her own. Roberto knew better. She looked too pale, and there was a rattle in her chest that frightened him. That same night, he sneaked her into the supply closet and played every soothing piece he knew. The vibrations of the strings lulled her, and her breathing calmed, but her skin remained clammy. Roberto's heart ached. He loved his sister more than anything. He was the only protector she had, after all. He wondered if maybe, if he had money, if he could just buy better medicine or pay a doctor, she would get well. That thought churned restlessly in his mind until he couldn't sleep. The next morning, while Felicity dozed fitfully, Roberto cradled the violin, pondering how to earn money. The staff hardly ever gave them pocket change, and those who did receive an allowance were older or helped with chores. He glanced outside. The city streets beyond the orphanage were always busy. He had seen street musicians in the nearby park. If they could do it, maybe he could as well. Music was one thing he was good at, after all. So, on a crisp gray afternoon, while Felicity lay in bed, Roberto slipped out with the violin. He stole away during chore time, ignoring the scolding caretaker's distant shout. The city was overwhelming: tall buildings, the honks of cars, the chatter of passers-by. He pushed through throngs of pedestrians until he reached a small plaza. There was a fountain in the center, and people tossed coins into it. Some were office workers grabbing a quick lunch, some were tourists snapping pictures, and some were simply out for a stroll. Roberto breathed in the cold air, set the violin case on the ground, and drew out his instrument. At first, the onlookers barely noticed. He was just a skinny boy with unruly hair and patched clothes. His hands trembled as he tightened the bow. He mentally ran through a lullaby, simple but heartfelt. He placed the violin under his chin, pressed the bow to the string, and started to play. His anxiety faded when the notes spilled forth, crisp and resonant. The melody rose above the bustle, weaving through the crowd, drawing curious gazes. Within moments, a small circle formed. Someone dropped a coin in the case. Then another. Roberto shut his eyes, letting the music carry him. He pictured Felicity, smiling as he lifted her spirits. He imagined that each note was a promise. He would get her medicine, he would make her well, they would be safe. By the time he finished, there was a modest pile of coins scattered in the open case. He felt a rush of triumph. People applauded politely. Some passers-by reached out to squeeze his shoulder or ruffle his hair. He saw empathy and appreciation in their faces, and his heart soared. For the first time, he felt as if he could do something that mattered. When he counted the coins, though, it was barely enough for a single dose of over-the-counter medication. He would need to do more. For the next week, Roberto sneaked out daily, playing more complex pieces. Though he couldn't read music well, he had an ear for any tune he heard. He reproduced popular folk songs, classical motifs, even jingles from advertisements. Each day, he collected a bit more change, sometimes enough to buy small groceries or second-hand cough medicine. Each night, he shared the spoils with Felicity, coaxing her to drink the medicine and nibble on a bit of bread or fruit. Slowly, her coughing subsided, though she remained frail. She thanked him with a gentle squeeze of his hand, her eyes shining with affection. But it wasn't enough. She wasn't recovering fully, and winter was only growing harsher. One afternoon, Roberto decided to push himself, playing longer, venturing into busier areas. He was careful to avoid the authorities, who might question a child musician with no permit. He lingered near an upscale shopping district, hoping the wealthy patrons would be more generous. He found a spot by a grand department store with high windows displaying gleaming jewelry and fashionable clothes. Tourists in expensive coats strolled by. He began to play a haunting melody he was sure he had heard before, somewhere deep in his subconscious, a memory of better times. The melody was beautiful, laced with longing and sorrow. People slowed to listen. After a few minutes, a tall, stern-faced man wearing a dark overcoat stepped closer, watching him intently. Roberto noticed the man's piercing eyes fixed on his fingers, on his bowing technique, on the way he swayed to the music. Something about that gaze made Roberto's skin prickle. The man was older, with hair that was mostly gray. He stood with an air of authority, arms folded. Even after Roberto finished and collected coins, the man didn't move. He simply waited. Roberto swallowed hard and started playing again, this time a lively piece that might attract more coins. The crisp notes mingled with the city noise, building a tapestry of sound. He tried to ignore the man's stare, tried to focus on the passers-by who tossed coins into the case. But out of the corner of his eye, he saw the man's expression shift from curiosity to something deeper. When the piece ended, the man stepped forward and dropped a single silver coin in the case. Roberto mumbled a thank you. The man's voice, low and firm, stopped Roberto in his tracks. "Where did you learn to play that first melody?" the man asked. Roberto could only stare at him, uncertain how to answer. I'm not sure," he admitted. "I just remember it." The man narrowed his eyes. "It's not a common piece. Are you certain no one taught it to you?" Roberto shook his head. "No, it just came to me." The man studied Roberto a moment longer, as if weighing his answer. Then he said, "Be careful, boy. That tune might bring you more trouble than you realize." With that, he turned on his heel and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Roberto stunned and slightly unnerved. All the coins he had collected felt cold in his hands. That night, after giving Felicity her medicine and tucking her in, Roberto paced the dormitory, the man's words replaying in his mind. Why would a particular melody be trouble? Maybe it was nonsense, the ramblings of a cranky stranger. But something about that moment, the man's intensity, lingered like a minor chord unresolved. Days passed. Roberto continued his street performances, but now he was jumpy, expecting that man to appear again. Whenever he was on a corner or near a busy market, he scanned the faces in the crowd. Each time a tall figure in an overcoat crossed his path, his heart lurched. Yet the mysterious man didn't show up again, and slowly Roberto's weariness subsided. Then, late one evening, everything changed. Felicity's fever returned with a vengeance after a scuffle with some older bullies. She coughed so violently that Roberto feared she might crack a rib. In desperation, he tried to soothe her with music, but the staff burst into the closet, scolding him for disturbing the peace. When he pleaded for help, one caregiver sighed and said there was an underfunded clinic at the edge of town that might help, but the orphanage couldn't pay. They suggested that if Roberto could find some charitable group, maybe they would treat Felicity. Roberto wanted to scream at them. He wanted to throw the violin across the floor. But he held his rage in check. He thanked them curtly, and carried Felicity back to her bunk. She was burning up, drifting in and out of sleep. Roberto sneaked out the next morning before dawn, desperate to earn more money. He didn't even check if the staff were awake. He rushed to the busiest square in town. Commuters hurried to work, and the crowd was thick. He set his violin case down and began a frantic performance, practically forcing the bow across the strings. The sound was rough, not his usual tender playing. His chest tightened with every note. He pictured Felicity in her bunk, gasping for breath. The coins trickled in, but not fast enough for him. He finished one piece and jumped straight into another. Suddenly, a black car with tinted windows pulled up to the curb behind him, and the stern man from before stepped out. Roberto's heart plummeted. The man slowly walked forward, arms behind his back, face unreadable. Roberto kept playing, not sure if he should run or stay. The man waited until he finished, then spoke again. "You're desperate, aren't you?" the man said, flicking his eyes over the meager pile of coins. Roberto didn't answer. His mouth went dry. The man reached into his coat, pulled out a wad of bills, and tucked them into Roberto's violin case. Shocked, Roberto glanced down. It was more money than he had ever seen. "Take her to a proper doctor," the man said softly. "I hear there's a good private clinic on Brook Street." Roberto croaked. "Why are you helping me?" The man's face remained stern, but there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "That melody you played, it was written by someone I once knew. Someone important. That's all you need to know." He gave a small nod and then stepped back to the car. Before Roberto could summon the courage to ask his name, the car disappeared into the traffic. In its wake, Roberto was left trembling, clutching the money as if it might vanish. He didn't waste a moment. He bolted to a pharmacy for medication and then hurried back to the orphanage. Felicity was still feverish, but at least the caregivers allowed him to administer the new meds. He sat by her side all night, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. A few days later, she was stable enough that Roberto could slip out and secure an appointment at the clinic. The look of astonishment on the receptionist's face when this ragged boy produced enough cash to pay for his sister's consultation was etched in his memory. The doctor diagnosed Felicity with a persistent respiratory infection, worsened by stress and cold. She recommended a strict regimen, better nutrition, and rest in a warm environment, something the orphanage couldn't easily provide. Still, they prescribed more effective medication, and Felicity's condition slowly improved. All the while, Roberto couldn't stop thinking about the man's words. "That melody was written by someone I once knew." Could that melody come from his birth parents? He remembered faint images of a lavish room, a piano, and a woman's gentle voice, but it was so hazy. The question gnawed at him, stirring the embers of hope that perhaps he and Felicity had a family somewhere, someone who might love them. About 2 weeks later, when Felicity's cough nearly subsided, the orphanage staff delivered surprising news. a wealthy man named Senor Aguilar was planning to adopt them both. Aguilar, the staff said, was a renowned musician with connections to the city's elite cultural circles. He had made inquiries at several orphanages, seeking siblings with musical inclinations. The staff couldn't believe their luck, a rich benefactor wanting not just one child, but two, and specifically drawn to Roberto's proven talent. Roberto's stomach twisted in anxiety. He hardly knew anything about this man, but adoption could mean a better life for Felicity, doctors, education, decent meals, a real home. For so long, they had yearned for something like that, but it felt unreal, like a cruel joke. When Aguilar arrived at the orphanage for the formalities, Roberto's heart thumped. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. His hair was salt and pepper, eyes alert but not unkind. He greeted Roberto and Felicity with a reserved smile. "Welcome," Aguilar said in a refined accent. "I've heard you're quite the violinist." He glanced at Roberto's battered case. "You'll have to show me your skills one day." Roberto didn't know how to respond. He just nodded stiffly, while Felicity, still shy and recovering, peered at the man from behind her brother's arm. Shortly after, papers were signed. The staff looked on in surprise and perhaps a hint of envy. They had never expected these two to leave the orphanage with such sudden fortune. Roberto and Felicity gathered their few belongings, mostly clothes, small trinkets, and of course, the violin. Some of the kinder staff and a few children waved goodbye, but there wasn't much fanfare. The two siblings climbed into Aguilar's sleek car, hearts pounding in tandem. The drive through the city was surreal. Neither sibling spoke. They passed towering buildings and crossed wide boulevards. Aguilar occasionally glanced at them, a thoughtful expression on his face. Eventually, they reached a large, gated estate. Roberto's mouth dropped. The fence was wrought iron, with swirling designs, and beyond it stretched a long driveway lined by old oak trees. At the end stood a mansion of pale stone, multiple stories high, with elegant pillars and tall windows. Stunned, Felicity squeezed Roberto's hand. She whispered, "Is this real?" When the car glided to a stop, staff in crisp uniforms opened the doors. They carried the children's meager belongings inside, as though these items were precious cargo. Roberto felt overwhelmed, disoriented by the sheer luxury. There was a fountain in the courtyard, marble floors in the foyer, and paintings adorning the walls. A faint hush pervaded the mansion, broken only by the quiet steps of servants and the distant hum of a violin's practice. "Welcome to your new home," Aguilar said simply. Before Roberto could speak, a young woman with braided dark hair stepped forward. She was dressed in a conservative blouse and skirt, perhaps a member of the household staff. "Sir," she addressed Aguilar, "should I show them to their rooms?" He gave a curt nod. "Yes, after you give them a quick tour of the common areas. I'm sure they must be tired, but let them see the music room." The young woman smiled at the children and said, "Follow me." Roberto and Felicity trailed behind, eyes wide at the grandeur. They passed a plush living room with velvet sofas, a sparkling chandelier, and shelves lined with leather-bound books. The dining hall was equally impressive, with a table large enough to seat 24 guests. Then came the music room, and Roberto's heart nearly stopped. The space was vast, with hardwood floors, tall windows that let in golden sunlight, and in the center, a grand piano. The walls were lined with instrument stands, violins, violas, cellos, a harp. There was a built-in stage on one side, and the acoustics carried the faint echo of footsteps. Roberto felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if he had glimpsed such a room in a dream, or perhaps in that faint memory of his childhood. "This is where Senor Aguilar practices and composes," the young woman explained softly. "He's quite famous, you know. Has performed in concerts across the country. He was once a celebrated violinist, but lately he's been more of a patron and composer." Felicity, still weak, pressed her hand to the side of her head, her eyes flicking around in awe. Roberto noticed a swirl of excitement in her gaze that he had never seen before, a spark that said maybe their luck had changed. They proceeded upstairs to a long hallway of bedrooms. Each was lavish, with big windows, soft bedding, and heavy curtains. The staff woman showed them 2 adjoining rooms. "These will be yours," she said with a small smile. "If you need anything, just ring the bell." She gestured to a pull cord near the door. Felicity was speechless. Roberto was too. They were used to cramped bunk beds and a single tattered blanket. Now they each had a bed, a dresser, and a desk with drawers for personal items. Roberto set his violin case carefully atop his bed, not sure what to do with it. It felt oddly out of place, like something that belonged to a different reality. As they were settling in, there was a soft knock on the door. A girl around Roberto's age stepped in. She had a delicate face, with dark hair tied back in a tidy ponytail. She wore a neat blouse and skirt, her posture perfectly straight. Her eyes flicked over Roberto and Felicity, as though she were appraising them. "Hello?" she said in a subdued tone. "I'm Cecilia. My father asked me to welcome you." She glanced at the violin case, but didn't comment on it. Instead, she tilted her head. "My father mentioned you're both orphans who like music." Roberto was slightly defensive at the phrase. "Both orphans?" But he dipped his head politely. "Yes, I'm Roberto, and this is Felicity." Cecilia didn't smile, but she nodded. "Dinner is usually at 7. Father likes us to dress nicely. There are clothes in your closets that should fit. If not, we can have the tailor adjust them." "Thank you," Felicity murmured. She was still a bit timid, stepping back half a pace behind Roberto. Cecilia's gaze lingered on the black violin case. "We can talk more at dinner," she said, then left the room as quietly as she arrived. Roberto couldn't read her. She seemed polite but distant, maybe even cold. He wondered if she resented their presence. Perhaps she was used to having her father's attention all to herself, and now 2 new children had appeared out of nowhere. That evening, dinner was a formal affair, silverware arranged meticulously, multiple courses served by uniformed staff. Felicity fumbled with the knives, and Roberto had no clue which fork to use for the salad. Cecilia, seated beside her father, used her utensils with practiced ease. She only glanced Roberto's way once or twice, her expression unreadable. Senor Aguilera inquired politely about their first day, whether they had found everything comfortable. Roberto answered in short phrases, too overwhelmed to say more. Felicity remained shy, stirring her soup nervously, though she occasionally looked up with gratitude. The caregivers had never fed them anything like this, and she had never tasted such rich flavors. Aguilera then mentioned, "I'll have to hear you play soon, Roberto. Don't think I've forgotten. Perhaps you and Cecilia can practice something together. She's quite accomplished on piano and harp." Cecilia set down her fork, a flicker of tension crossing her face. "Yes, father," she said quietly. Roberto wondered if this was what his future held, formal dinner conversations about music. A pang of longing hit him for Felicity's laughter and the cozy supply closet where he could play without judgment. Still, he couldn't deny the advantages. Felicity's health could improve here, and maybe, just maybe, he could uncover clues about his own past. The melody that man recognized, could Aguilera know something about it? Life in the mansion began in earnest the next day. Aguilera arranged for private tutors to come in the mornings, teaching math, language, music theory, and history. For Roberto and Felicity it was a crash course. They were behind academically, having had only the orphanage's scant lessons. The tutors were patient, and the siblings were eager to learn. Cecilia shared some classes with them but then broke off to practice advanced piano or harp. Roberto noticed that the tutors called her Miss Cecilia, with a hint of deference. She seemed well known for her musical prowess, but she also carried a distant sadness that was hard to define. In the afternoons, Aguilera encouraged them to practice instruments. He showed Roberto the mansion's music library, filled with sheet music from centuries past. Roberto's eyes roamed over titles he had never heard of, composers he couldn't pronounce. Though reading sheet music was still challenging, he was determined to learn. Felicity, on the other hand, seemed more interested in listening than performing, though she plunked a few curious notes on the piano from time to time. She was content to stand by, a small smile lighting her face as she watched Roberto experiment with new pieces. Cecilia was often in the room too, practicing scales on the piano with clinical precision. Her father's voice sometimes floated from the hallway, offering corrections. "Softer there, watch the tempo, your crescendo is too abrupt." Cecilia never complained, but Roberto could see the tension in her shoulders. One evening, while Roberto was carefully plucking out a melody on the violin, Cecilia set aside her piano books and spoke. "You have a good ear. You don't rely on the sheet music as much as I do." Roberto lowered his violin. "I guess I'm used to playing by ear. The orphanage never had enough resources for formal lessons." She nodded, fiddling with the edge of her sheet music. "Father wants me to be perfect. But sometimes, even if I practice for hours, I can't quite match what he envisions." Roberto hesitated before asking, "Do you even enjoy it?" Cecilia's gaze flicked to him. For a moment, he saw a yearning that mirrored his own. "I love music," she said quietly, "but I'm not sure I love being perfect at it." She looked away. "Father's standards are very high. He says only excellence will bring success. He wants me to, well, it doesn't matter." Roberto sensed that there was more to her story, but he didn't press. They lapsed into an awkward silence. Later that night, while lying in his plush bed in the darkened room, Roberto wondered if maybe Cecilia was as lonely as he once was, but for a different reason. She had wealth and opportunity, but perhaps not much freedom. He thought of Felicity sleeping next door and felt gratitude that, at least, they were together. He vowed to protect her, no matter what. Time passed, and the siblings grew accustomed to the mansion's routines. Mornings with tutors, afternoons of practice, evenings of structured family dinners. Aguilera was not unkind, but he was definitely a strict figure, especially when it came to music. He insisted that Roberto show him everything he knew on the violin, carefully critiquing his posture, his bow grip, his intonation. It was intimidating, but Roberto tried to glean what he could. Sometimes he had a flashback while playing, faint images of a woman's delicate hands guiding his tiny fingers, a swirl of golden hair. When these flashes came, his playing faltered, and Aguilera mistook it for inattention, reprimanding him to focus. Roberto never mentioned the memories, unsure how Aguilera would react. Felicity's health improved steadily. The color returned to her cheeks. She explored the mansion's gardens, sometimes gathering flowers to decorate their bedroom. She was the only one who could make Cecilia laugh, albeit briefly. It happened one afternoon when Felicity tried to mimic the harp, plucking imaginary strings in an exaggerated manner. Cecilia giggled unexpectedly, a genuine sound that transformed her usually reserved expression. Roberto, passing by, caught that moment and felt a surprising warmth. Maybe this strange new family could be something more. However, not all was smooth. There were times when the distance between Cecilia and Roberto was palpable. He sensed her resentment that her father spent extra time guiding Roberto's violin technique. Or maybe she resented that two strangers had been plucked from an orphanage to share her home. Roberto couldn't blame her if that was the case, but it still stung. They barely spoke unless it was about music. Then, one evening at dinner, Aguilera announced, "There is a prestigious music contest coming up in a few months. It's for young talents, violin, piano, various instruments. I've decided Roberto and Cecilia will enter together, as a duet." Cecilia's fork clattered against her plate. Felicity's eyes widened, glancing at Roberto in excitement. Roberto, on the other hand, felt panic. A duet? With Cecilia, who had been trained her whole life. He had never performed in a formal setting, only on the street or in front of small groups at the orphanage. The notion of a competition, with judges and an audience, knotted his stomach. Aguilera continued, "I'll choose the piece, something that highlights both violin and piano. Cecilia can handle the arrangement. We'll begin rehearsals immediately." Cecilia looked down, her face unreadable. "Yes, father," she said softly, though her voice trembled just enough for Roberto to catch it. Roberto tried to hide his nervousness. I'll do my best, senor. Felicity beamed, whispering words of encouragement to Roberto when they retreated to their rooms later. You're going to do great, she said, hugging him. Just remember the way you played on the street, the way you played for me. It's different, he muttered. This is a real contest, with real critics. And Cecilia is so advanced. She needs you just as much, Felicity said with certainty, her childish but wise voice echoing in the hallway. Maybe she's scared too. Roberto pondered that. Could it be that Cecilia was afraid of failing her father's expectations? In any case, he had no choice but to throw himself into the rehearsals. Over the next weeks, practice became more intense. Aguilera assigned them a challenging piece, a classical duet known for its technical demands. Cecilia played the piano part flawlessly, but Roberto struggled with the complicated runs and shifts. He could hear his mistakes, the intonation going off on the higher notes. Sometimes he got so frustrated that he had to stop and gather himself. Cecilia remained stoic, though now and then she offered a tip. Use more bow pressure on that phrase. Or, your tempo is dragging. He tried to accept her advice without feeling overshadowed. Aguilera watched them like a hawk, commanding them to redo difficult passages until they were near perfect. As the contest date drew nearer, tension within the household rose. Aguilera's temperament grew harsher. He scolded Cecilia for even the slightest stumble in her fingering, demanding she practice hours on end. Cecilia's eyes grew dull with fatigue, and her shoulders slumped. Roberto's own nerves frayed, but he tried to remain strong for Felicity, who cheered him on daily. Sometimes, Roberto wondered if music was meant to be this stressful. He remembered how it felt in the supply closet at the orphanage, how playing soothed him, connected him to fleeting memories of happiness. Now it felt like a high-wire act, a test he might fail at any moment. One day, a week before the contest, they had a rehearsal in the grand music room. Aguilera stood behind them, arms crossed. Cecilia was perfect on the piano, her fingers gliding over the keys in a swift, practiced dance. Roberto's violin resonated well, until they reached a complex transition. He hesitated half a beat, and the notes slipped away from him. The resulting sound was jarring. Aguilera slapped a hand on the edge of the piano. Again, he snapped. You have to coordinate with your partner. If you hesitate, she can't synchronize. Roberto's cheeks burned. He restarted the passage, forcing himself to concentrate. This time, they hit the notes correctly, though not with the fluidity he wanted. When the piece ended, Aguilera exhaled sharply. That will do for now, he said, displeasure evident in his voice. But you'll need private practice tonight, Roberto. I won't have you embarrassing Cecilia on stage. Roberto hung his head. Anger stirred inside him, but it was overshadowed by shame. He hated feeling so inadequate, especially when Cecilia was watching from her piano bench with an inscrutable expression. That night, Roberto couldn't sleep. He tiptoed to the music room, turning on a soft lamp by the windows. The shadows of the mansion flickered around him. He tightened his bow and started to play the tricky section over and over, gritting his teeth every time he faltered. But something about the environment helped. The hush of night, the echo of the violin in the large room, reminded him of those nights in the orphanage closet. Eventually, his frustration faded and he found a gentle flow, his fingers dancing over the strings. For a moment, he forgot the competition. He thought only of Felicity's fragile smile, and the intangible memory of a mother's lullaby, swirling in the corners of his mind. He didn't realize Cecilia had entered the room until she spoke quietly from behind him. You're better when you're not scared. He nearly jumped. Oh. Cecilia, sorry, She stepped closer. I wasn't spying, but I heard the music. You sound free. Roberto lowered the violin. I guess it's because no one's watching. Except you? He added that last part self-consciously. A small smile formed on her lips. Father means well, I think. He just wants us to succeed. Her voice softened. But I'm so tired of being scared to make mistakes. Roberto nodded, feeling a strange kinship in that moment. Me too. She met his eyes. Do you remember that melody you played sometimes? Not the duet piece, but something else? I heard you humming it under your breath. It's unusual, kind of haunting. His heartbeat picked up. He knew exactly which melody she referred to, the one the stern man in the street recognized. I'm not sure where I learned it, he admitted. It feels familiar, like a memory from when I was very young. Cecilia looked intrigued. Could it be something from your real family? I think so, Roberto said, swallowing. I only remember glimpses, a grand house, a piano, a woman's voice singing. I'm not sure if any of it was real or just my imagination. But it feels real. She glanced around the lavish music room. I wonder if that house you remember was like this place. Maybe, Roberto murmured, feeling a sudden swirl of emotions. The memory was too vague, yet something about being here triggered it. Cecilia, he added softly, do you ever wonder if there's more to your father's choice in adopting us than just the competition? You've known him longer. Do you think he's just doing this out of kindness? She exhaled, setting her gaze on the polished piano. Father rarely does anything without a reason. But I can't claim to know all his motives. He's been distant with me for a while now. My mother passed away when I was young, so it's always been just him and me. Then you two arrived. She turned to Roberto. But I don't resent you, she clarified, as though reading his mind. I was worried at first, yes. But I'm starting to see that maybe you need him as much as I do. Maybe he saw something in you that reminded him of. She trailed off. Roberto's heart thrummed. Reminded him of what, or whom? Before he could ask, she changed the subject. We have a big day tomorrow. Practice, tutoring, final touches before the contest. Let's try not to stress. Maybe if we just play from the heart, it'll come out right. He gave a shaky smile. I'll try. Cecilia slipped away, and Roberto stood there, bow in hand, feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. There was a connection forming between them, an understanding that they were both trapped by expectations. He hoped that after the contest, they could find a calmer rhythm. For now, though, the countdown continued. The day of the competition arrived in a flurry of nerves. The venue was a grand concert hall in the city center, with a stage framed by plush red curtains and a magnificent chandelier overhead. The seats filled with an audience of music lovers, teachers, sponsors, and other participants' families. Roberto and Cecilia waited backstage, dressed in formal attire. Felicity and Aguilera sat in the front row. Felicity waved encouragingly every time Roberto peeked from behind the curtain. The contest proceeded in categories. Pianists, cellists, flutists, and other violinists came and went, each performing their piece. Some were children as young as 8, others were teenagers on the brink of professional careers. Roberto's hands were damp. He tried to breathe deeply, recalling how it felt to just play in the quiet of the music room. Cecilia, standing next to him, was unusually pale. He saw her shoulders tense when the announcer called their names for the duet category. They stepped onto the stage. The lights felt blinding. Roberto adjusted the violin under his chin, and Cecilia sat before the piano, posture poised, though her lips were pressed in. She gave a minute nod. The hush in the audience was tangible. The first half of the piece went smoothly. Cecilia's piano lines flowed, precise as ever. Roberto's violin responded. They had rehearsed this 1,000 times, so muscle memory guided them. The audience seemed captivated by the interplay of melodic lines. Roberto could almost forget his anxiety. Then came the tricky section, the one that had kept him awake at night. He counted the beats, shifted his hand position, and slid into the run. To his immense relief, he nailed the passage. A wave of confidence surged through him. He could see Felicity beaming in the front row. Moments later, though, something unexpected happened. Cecilia's fingers slipped on a rapid arpeggio. It was a minor slip, just enough to produce a discordant note. Roberto sensed her panic. She tried to recover, but her tempo faltered. For an instant, The duet wobbled. Roberto reacted instinctively, stretching his note a fraction longer, giving Cecilia time to catch up. They managed to realign, but the earlier perfection was shaken. He could hear some murmurs in the audience. Aguilera's face looked stony. They finished the piece, ending on a resounding chord. The audience clapped, some more enthusiastically than others. Roberto bowed stiffly. Cecilia's cheeks were flushed, and her eyes glistened with embarrassment. As they left the stage, she whispered a choked apology. He tried to offer a comforting pat on her shoulder, but she was too distraught. When the results were announced, Roberto and Cecilia placed second in their category, which was still a respectable achievement. But from Aguilera's perspective, second place might as well have been last. Back at the mansion that evening, the mood was solemn. Cecilia was nowhere to be seen during dinner, and Felicity sensed the tension, her big eyes darting nervously from Roberto to Aguilera's grim face. Eventually, Aguilera cleared his throat. "One minor mistake can ruin the entire performance," he said sharply, not looking at anyone in particular. "You both must learn that excellence requires consistency. We can't afford such slips if you plan to compete at a national level." Roberto wanted to defend Cecilia, to point out that they still took second place, and that mistakes happened. But he was too intimidated. Felicity, surprisingly, was the one who mustered the courage. "They did really well," she said, voice quivering slightly. "I heard a lot of people clapping." Aguilera's gaze flicked to Felicity. For a moment, he looked like he might rebuke her, but he simply let out a heavy sigh. "Perhaps I'm expecting too much too soon," he conceded in a gruff tone. Then he stood and left the dining room. Felicity slumped in relief. Roberto stared at his half-eaten meal, wishing he could chase after Cecilia, but he wasn't sure where she had gone. He found her later in the music room, sitting at the piano with the lid closed, her head resting against folded arms. She was crying silently. Roberto hesitated by the door, then stepped in. "Cecilia," he said gently, "it's okay. We still did well." She shook her head. "I messed up. Father was right, I wasn't consistent. If I could just... I practiced so hard and..." Her words broke off into a sob. Roberto edged closer, placing a hesitant hand on her shoulder. "We're human. Mistakes happen. Maybe your father expects perfection, but you're allowed to slip." She lifted her tear-streaked face. "He taught me everything I know. I feel like I let him down. I hate that feeling." She swallowed hard, wiping her eyes. I wish he could see that sometimes I just want to enjoy music, not conquer it." Roberto's heart clenched at the raw longing in her voice. He understood it intimately, the difference between playing to survive or please others, and playing for the sheer love of it. Gently, he said, "We can figure this out together. You know, I never thought I'd be anywhere but that orphanage. Being here, it's so much. But if there's one thing I know, it's that music can help us heal." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting out a long breath. "Thank you," she whispered. They shared a brief, fragile moment of connection. Roberto could almost feel the shift in the air around them, as if a wall were finally cracking. Over the following weeks, the household quieted down. Aguilera remained stern, but some of the immediate tension dissipated. He didn't mention the contest results again, perhaps deciding that further reproach wasn't helpful. Cecilia resumed her rigorous practice, but Roberto noticed she was a touch more relaxed. She sometimes invited him to practice simpler duets, purely for fun, without the weight of competition. Felicity hovered around them, humming or offering commentary in her sweet, naive manner, helping them realize that, yes, music was also about enjoyment. During this calmer period, Roberto's curiosity about his past intensified. He started to poke around the mansion, looking for old photographs or letters. He knew it was snooping, but something within him urged him to find a clue. Had Aguilera adopted them because he recognized that melody, or because of some connection to their parents? One afternoon, while rummaging in a rarely used sitting room, Roberto found a small box of old concert programs. Flipping through them, he saw pictures of a younger Aguilera performing in various halls. Then a name jumped out, Carmen Mendoza, violin soloist, performing with Maestro Aguilera. Roberto's pulse quickened. Could that be the CM on his violin? Carmen, was that his mother? He tried to recall the faint memory of a woman in a swirl of golden hair, but his mind couldn't form the details. He sneaked the program back to his room and studied it. Carmen Mendoza, accompanied by the famous teacher and conductor, Señor Aguilera. There was no mention of any personal relationship, just that they had collaborated on multiple concerts. He noticed the date. The concert had taken place around a decade ago, near the time he was born. As he traced the printed letters with his fingertips, tears threatened to fall. He was so close to unraveling the truth. That night, he mustered his courage and approached Aguilera in the study. The older man was at his desk, scribbling notes on sheet music. Roberto cleared his throat, heart hammering. "Señor Aguilera, may I ask you something?" Aguilera set down his pen. "Yes, what is it?" Roberto stepped forward, holding the program. "Did you know Carmen Mendoza? Was she related to me?" Aguilera's expression darkened. He took the program from Roberto's shaking hand. For a moment he said nothing, his gaze distant. Then he exhaled heavily, the lines on his face deepening. "Yes. I knew Carmen," he admitted quietly. Roberto's breath caught. "Was she my mother?" Aguilera looked pained. "I suspected you might be her son when I first saw you play. The posture, the fluid style, the way you held the bow, it was uncannily like hers. And yes, your violin has her initials, which was a clue. But until we confirmed certain details, I couldn't be sure. Now I see you've found evidence." Trembling, Roberto asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" Aguilera lowered his gaze. "Because it's a painful story, one I wasn't sure you were ready to hear. Carmen was an extraordinary musician, my prized student, and eventually my colleague. She came from a wealthy family, but she was estranged from them for a time. Later, she married a wealthy patron who helped fund our orchestra. They had 2 children. But they died in a car accident, the same year you were born. I was devastated by her loss, and I tried to find the children. There were rumors that one or both survived. Eventually, you and Felicity were found at an orphanage, but I didn't learn of it until recently." Roberto's eyes stung with tears. "And Felicity, she's my sister, so Carmen is her mother too?" Aguilera nodded. "Yes. As soon as I confirmed you two were the ones, I arranged the adoption. I wanted to honor Carmen's memory, to give you both the life she would have wanted you to have." He hesitated. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you right away. I wasn't certain how to break the news, and I had my own fears." Roberto struggled to digest this avalanche of information. He recalled the dreamlike images of a grand house, a piano, his mother's laughter. All real, but overshadowed by tragedy. "What about my father?" he asked softly. Aguilera's mouth set in a grim line. "Your father was from a prominent family. He and Carmen loved each other deeply. After they married, they lived in that grand home you might recall. When they died, the extended family squabbled over inheritance. The children, you too, somehow fell through the cracks of an ugly legal battle. It was all so chaotic and secretive. By the time I realized what had happened, you were already in the system." Roberto wiped at his eyes, emotions roiling, grief for parents he barely knew, relief at finally having answers, and confusion over why it took so long. "So you do want us here, not just to train me for contests?" A flicker of guilt crossed Aguilera's face. "Yes, Roberto. I admit I had other reasons too. When I heard about your talent, I saw Carmen in you. Selfishly, I wanted to nurture that gift, to keep her memory alive. But it wasn't just about winning contests." Tears slid down Roberto's cheeks as he thought of Felicity, her fragile health, the countless nights they spent alone. Still, a weight lifted from his chest now that the truth was out. He glanced at Aguilera. "Thank you for telling me." Aguilera nodded solemnly. "You may ask me anything else you wish to know. I'll do my best to provide answers." In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted. Aguilera encouraged Roberto and Felicity to ask about Carmen, about the wealthy patron who was their father. The man's name was Esteban Lopez, a quiet but generous benefactor of the arts. Aguilera showed them old photographs, Carmen, smiling radiantly with her violin, and a tall, handsome Esteban by her side. Felicity gazed at them, tears brimming. She remembered almost nothing of that life, yet there was a strange sense of belonging. Aguilera also shared how heartbreak consumed him after losing his dear student and collaborator. Adopting them, in a way, was redemption for him as well. Cecilia seemed relieved that secrets were no longer cloaking the household. She tiptoed around the subject at first, uncertain how to talk about Roberto's newly uncovered heritage. But one afternoon, as she and Roberto relaxed by the rose garden, she reached over and held his hand. "I'm glad you finally know," she said gently, giving him a shy smile. "For a while, I sensed my father was hiding something. Now that everything's in the open, maybe we can just be a family." Roberto looked at her soft, earnest face and felt warmth flood him. He had come to care about her more deeply than he ever expected. Quiet moments like these, away from the pressures of practice, let him see her kindness. He noticed how her eyes sparkled when she was pleased, how she tucked a stray curl behind her ear when she was nervous. He had never felt so connected to someone outside of Felicity. Time passed. Roberto and Felicity continued to thrive in the mansion's nurturing environment, forging a clearer identity as the children of Carmen Mendoza and Esteban Lopez. Aguilera helped Roberto with advanced violin training, but now it was without that intense, overbearing pressure. Cecilia continued her piano and harp, but she too seemed liberated from the constant fear of failing her father. The home, once echoing with tension, now resonated with genuine affection and the mingling of sweet melodies. As months turned into years, Roberto and Cecilia grew into talented young musicians, often performing together at local recitals. Their bond deepened, fueled by countless hours spent practicing, laughing, and sharing the weight of their family histories. Felicity flourished as well, free from the ailments that once plagued her. She developed an interest in creative arts, dabbling in painting the scenes around the mansion. Sometimes, Roberto caught Felicity painting the image of a woman in a swirling golden gown, a tribute to the mother she never properly knew. One pivotal moment arrived when Roberto was accepted into a prestigious music academy. Cecilia, equally gifted, received an invitation too. Aguilera was proud, beaming in a way that Roberto had rarely seen. Felicity, though she was younger, cheered them on, promising to visit the academy whenever she could. So, at 17, Roberto and Cecilia embarked on a new chapter of their lives, enrolling in formal training that honed their raw talent. The shift was exciting but daunting. They moved into academy dorms, returning to the mansion on weekends. Their days filled with master classes, ensembles, performances. They faced stiff competition from other prodigies. There were times they leaned on each other for support, times they felt the strain of individual achievements overshadowing their duet synergy. But through it all, their partnership endured. During their second year at the academy, Roberto summoned the courage to confess his feelings for Cecilia. They were on a campus balcony after a recital, the twilight sky streaked with purple and orange. He stumbled over his words, cheeks reddening, but Cecilia just laughed softly and kissed him, tears in her eyes. "I've felt the same for so long," she murmured. Their relationship blossomed into something tender and profound, built on shared music and mutual respect. Aguilera, when he noticed their closeness, didn't object. Perhaps he saw it as fate, or perhaps he was simply content that they had found happiness. After graduating, Roberto and Cecilia landed positions in a renowned orchestra, traveling to various cities to perform. They remained deeply connected to Felicity, who continued her own path, dabbling in visual arts and eventually hosting small gallery shows. Meanwhile, Roberto and Cecilia's reputations grew in the music world. Their duets, once begun in the orphanage supply closet and the mansion's music room, now echoed through grand concert halls. The press dubbed them a musical power couple. and they handled the attention with grace. But beyond the excitement of performing, they still held on to the dream of truly reclaiming their heritage, reconnecting with the memory of Carmen and Esteban. They visited the old property that once belonged to Roberto's father's family. It had changed hands, neglected and in disrepair, but they walked the grounds and sensed the echoes of the past. Felicity joined them, tears filling her eyes as she touched crumbling walls that might have once sheltered them. They talked about possibly restoring it, but that was a dream for the future. For now, they had each other, and that was enough. Eventually, at an age not much beyond their early 20s, Roberto and Cecilia exchanged vows in a modest ceremony. It was held in the mansion's rose garden, the place where Cecilia once took Roberto's hand and welcomed him. Aguilera stood by proudly, officiating in his own dignified way, while Felicity and a handful of close friends and fellow musicians witnessed the event. The newlyweds played a duet as part of their wedding ceremony, the same classical piece from that fateful competition, and this time, every note was a testament to their journey. Life brimmed with possibility. They continued performing, traveling, teaching. Roberto never stopped cherishing the black violin, Carmen Mendoza's violin, a symbol of everything that had once been lost. Felicity remained close, occasionally traveling with them, unveiling her artwork inspired by the music they created. And then, some years later, a new joy arrived. They welcomed a son, named Roberto after his father, though they often called him Robbie, to avoid confusion. The child grew up in an environment of creativity and love, hearing lullabies on violin and harp instead of the orphanage's silence. He giggled when Cecilia played gentle scales on the piano or when Roberto hummed that mysterious melody Carmen once wrote. The cycle of music and heritage continued. In the mansion, Aguilera's hair had turned fully white. He doted on his grandson, smiling more often than anyone would have believed in the past. Though he never truly got over Carmen's death, it was clear that seeing Roberto and Felicity flourish gave him a sense of redemption. And when Robbie was old enough to toddle around, plucking at piano strings or squeaking out notes on a miniature violin, Aguilera's laughter resonated through the halls. One bright afternoon, Cecilia and Roberto stood by the grand piano in the music room, watching their son attempt to pick out a simple tune on the small violin. Felicity was nearby, painting the scene. The sunlight filtered through the tall windows, dancing across the floor. Roberto glanced at Cecilia, recalling how once, years ago, they both felt burdened by a weight of expectation and sadness. Now, the mansion felt alive with hope. They had reclaimed a heritage that once seemed lost, forging it into something that breathed warmth, family, and music. A few days later, the mailman who arrived at the gates of the estate was the same one who had once found Felicity crying on the sidewalk near the orphanage. Felicity, now an elegant young woman, recognized him. A jolt of memory passed between them. He looked astonished that the timid child he once comforted now stood radiant, inviting him into a world of art and music. Life had a way of weaving people's paths together in surprising ways. The final piece of the puzzle, Roberto realized, was his mother's original sheet music. Aguilera had kept it in a secure place, waiting for the right moment to present it to him. One evening, after a small family concert at the mansion, Aguilera called Roberto aside and handed him a weathered folder. Inside were handwritten musical scores titled, "Memories of a Golden Afternoon," by Carmen Mendoza. The melody that had haunted Roberto's mind for so long was there, along with other compositions he had never heard. Tears filled his eyes as he traced the notes his mother had written decades ago. "Continue her legacy," Aguilera said softly. "I will," Roberto answered, voice shaking. "Thank you for everything." He knew the journey had been painful at times, filled with uncertainty and sorrow. But in that moment, with the folder in hand, he felt complete. He, Cecilia, Felicity, even little Robbie, they were part of a family tapestry woven by music, love, and second chances. They would move forward, shaping a future bright with possibilities. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.